Take that medal off. This is a courtroom, not a parade for black folks. That's what a white judge said, in front of everyone, to an elderly black man standing quietly in uniform, his purple heart gleaming brighter than the gavel in that courtroom. But this wasn't just any man. He was Colonel Thomas Vincent Ellis, a battlefield hero who once saved the life of a U.S. general's son. And that day, he didn't come to be judged. He came to make the system judge itself. If honor can be treated like disorderly conduct, what does that say about justice where you live? What state are you in? And could this happen to your father? Let's begin today's story. Thomas Vincent Ellis stepped through the doors of Wexley Federal Courthouse with a gait that was neither hurried nor slow, just steady enough that the soft tapping of his wooden cane echoed clearly along the marble floor of the silent hallway. He was 62 years old, dark-skinned, his military uniform perfectly pressed, and the purple heart pin to his left chest caught the fluorescent light like a quiet declaration. I bled for this country. It was a crisp autumn morning in Wexley Borough, Georgia, clear skies, the air just chilly enough to stir the nerves. Thomas, a veteran who had served 32 years in the U.S. Army, was reporting for jury duty after receiving a summons. He could have requested an exemption for his old leg injury, a lasting wound from Desert Storm, but he didn't. Civic duty, he muttered while ironing his uniform at dawn. If I don't stand up, who will? As he entered the jury waiting room, eyes immediately turned his way, some respectful, others curious, and a few suspicious. Thomas simply nodded, saying nothing, as if already accustomed to every kind of gaze from past lives. A white police officer in a beige uniform, round-bellied and squinting, eyed Thomas. "You're going to have to take off that costume before heading into the courtroom," he said with a tone laced in contempt and irritation. Thomas met his gaze, voice calm as still water. "This is a real uniform, and these medals aren't for show, they're for remembrance." The officer rolled his eyes. "Well, just make sure Judge Trent doesn't see it. He's not fond of theatrics." Before Thomas could reply, his jury group number was called. He walked forward without turning back, each step pressing his quiet resilience into the cold stone floor. When he entered Wexley Federal Courtroom, Judge Hollis Trent, known countywide for his biased rulings and stiff demeanor, was organizing papers at the bench. His eyes paused when they landed on Thomas. A faint smile, thin as paper, flickered across his face before quickly fading into a look of annoyance. Thomas didn't return the glance. He took his seat, spine straight, like a commanding officer inspecting a formation. The medal still glinted on his chest, unshaken, unapologetic. Within that cold courtroom, he had no idea that within moments, a quiet standoff would begin between a blood-earned honor and an entrenched seat of power. From the bench, Judge Hollis Trent flipped through the case file, but his gaze never left the man with the glowing medal. The pages were a formality. Thomas Vincent Ellis's presence was what truly tested his patience. In that brief instant, two worlds collided, one shaped by lifelong access to influence, the other by decades spent earning every inch of respect through service and sacrifice. Thomas needed no introduction. In the military, he had been a colonel, leading regiments through missions in Kuwait and Iraq. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, a shell shattered through a trench and struck his right hip. Doctors once said he'd never walk normally again. But Thomas did what he always did. He endured, pushed forward. The wooden cane he carried today was the legacy of a man who refused to surrender to time or pain. To Thomas, his uniform was not just fabric and thread. It was a ritual. Each morning, he hung it behind the door, pressed every crease, polished every brass button. The purple heart on his chest, he cleaned it most meticulously, not for pride, but because it bore the weight of three names, three soldiers who never made it home. Wearing the uniform to court wasn't a statement. It was reverence, a sign of respect for a system of justice he once believed in completely, a system he thought would stand if enough people stood for it. He hadn't expected, however, that this very choice would earn him wary glances and even contempt, as if the dignity of a lifetime had become an unwelcome sight to those who had forgotten what it meant. Mid-morning, during a break before voir dire, Thomas stood and exited the courtroom. His right knee throbbed with pain, but he moved slowly, deliberately into the hallway. Each step was a breath, a reminder of all he had endured and all he had lost. A young woman in a pale blue office dress passed him in the hallway. She paused, eyes falling to the metal on his chest, then rising to his face. "Sir, are you a hero?" Thomas offered a soft smile, but in his eyes swam an entire ocean of silence. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "Heroes are the ones who didn't make it back to wear these." She nodded, eyes welling with tears. Thomas turned away, not from shame, but because the memories came rushing too fast, too hard. In his mind, the distant explosions echoed again, and he knew what would unfold in that courtroom wasn't just about law. It would be another battle, not for land, but for dignity. As he returned to his seat, Thomas noticed a young man being escorted out of the jury pool. He was thin, with close-cropped curly hair, and left quietly, holding a basic criminal law textbook. Thomas glanced at the list and caught the name, Tobias M. Langford, skin brown like red clay. And it wasn't the first time that morning. In less than an hour, Thomas had counted 4 black juror candidates dismissed for reasons he was sick of hearing: lacked neutrality, too tied to the community, insufficient legal awareness. Meanwhile, a white man with a prior arrest for public drunkenness remained because he seemed thoughtful. Thomas said nothing. He simply noted it all. Every face, every excuse, every sidelong glance. His silence was not consent. It was the silence of a man who had been through war and knew that sometimes the only way to confront wrong is to wait for the right moment to fire. At recess, he stepped out of the courtroom, his leg aching more than usual. The rear hallway behind the main courtroom was mostly empty, save for a single door left slightly ajar, the clerk's office. Thomas was about to turn away when the unmistakable voice of Judge Hollis Trent rang out from inside. "You know what I need, Cheryl? Keep the right kind of people. Don't let this trial turn into some kind of community town hall." "Yes, Your Honor," a soft female voice replied. "That old guy with the medals, Freeman, or whatever. No, Ellis, right? Don't let him think he has a voice in here. This isn't a battlefield. This is my law." Thomas stood still, not moving an inch. His hand clenched tightly around the top of his cane. His expression didn't change, but inside, every nerve in his body was taut. Just then, a phone rang inside the room. Thomas took a step back, turned away, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. But the truth had already embedded itself in his mind like a piece of shrapnel never removed. As he returned to the main hallway, a young court staffer, probably an intern, rushed past, spilling coffee near his feet. "I'm so sorry, sir," the young man stammered, frantically trying to mop up the spreading stain, his face flushed. Thomas bent down and picked up the cup that had rolled out of the young man's reach. "It's all right, son," he said gently. "Sometimes what matters most isn't keeping the cup from falling. It's keeping your calm." The young man offered a sheepish smile, then added, I heard you speak this morning. Thank you for still being here." Thomas nodded. He didn't need thanks. But that moment, between the strong scent of coffee and the slanted light pouring through the hall window, told him he wasn't alone. No matter how corroded the system might be, there were still cracks of light wide enough for someone to notice and start asking questions. On the third morning, a light drizzle blanketed Wexley Borough, and the sky hung gray like a curtain drawn over the city's oldest secrets. Thomas Vincent Ellis arrived earlier than usual. His long coat covered his uniform beneath, but he didn't hide the Purple Heart. It remained pinned precisely on his chest, glowing faintly in the yellow-tinged hallway light of the courthouse. The security staff at the gate nodded silently as he passed. There was something in the way they looked at him, not fear, but quiet respect, as if they knew today would not be like any other day in court. Inside Wexley Federal Courtroom, the atmosphere was taut as a wire. As Thomas entered, whispers hushed. Every gaze turned to him. An elderly man in the back row placed a hand over his heart and nodded. A middle-aged woman whispered something to her son, tears shining in her eyes as she pointed at Thomas. Judge Hollis Trent entered later than usual, his face flushed as though he'd swallowed fire. The moment he saw Thomas, still wearing the medal, he straightened up and slammed the gavel against the bench. "Mr. Ellis," he barked, fury flaring in his voice. "I told you to remove any military insignia from this courtroom." Thomas rose slowly, voice low and resonant like steel. "Your Honor, I am not in uniform. I'm wearing a symbol of the wound I carry for life, a part of my body. This medal is not decoration. It is a reminder that I bled to defend the Constitution, including the right to a fair and impartial trial." Trent slammed his hand again. "You are in contempt of court. I am fining you $1,000 and removing you from the jury panel. You'll pay the fine before leaving this courthouse." The room fell silent. Then, a single sound broke through. A chair creaked. An elderly white man rose from the back row. Then a black woman in the middle of the courtroom stood. Next, a young man near the entrance with thick glasses got to his feet. Within seconds, nearly half the room was standing. No one spoke. They simply stood, like a silent choir honoring the man who refused to bow. Just then, an unexpected interruption. One of the side doors to the courtroom swung open. A young police officer, his face still fresh with youth, stepped inside and walked directly to Thomas. He leaned in and whispered something quickly. Thomas gave a slight nod, then turned to face Judge Trent. "Your Honor," he said, voice still calm. "This morning, I was informed that an internal recording had been sent to the press regarding racially charged language used during the jury selection process." A ripple of gasps swept the room. Trent froze. "What exactly are you implying?" Thomas responded with unnerving composure. "I'm not implying anything. I just believe there's a storm coming, and not everyone brought a coat." Then he turned and walked out, his cane tapping steadily against the marble floor. Behind him, the murmurs began, not fear anymore, but the sound of something awakening. In that courtroom, where power once believed itself untouchable, a crack had just started to spread. That afternoon, as Thomas Vincent Ellis returned home to Glenfield Heights, the landline phone was already ringing off the hook. He had just slipped off his rain-soaked leather shoes when the phone rang again, and this time he picked up. "Mr. Ellis? This is Mira Thatch, a reporter from the Wexley Ledger. I was in the courtroom this morning and witnessed the entire incident. I'd like to ask, would you be willing to share your story?" Thomas was silent for a few seconds. He had never liked cameras or bold headlines. But there was something in Myra's voice, steady, unhurried, that made him reply, "You come by at 5. But I don't answer softball questions." "All right, I'll bring coffee," Myra replied, then hung up. When she arrived, he had already set out 2 chairs on the porch beneath a trellis tangled with vines. The late afternoon sun spilled across the white picket fence, and the breeze carried the scent of damp soil and freshly cut grass. Myra didn't start with questions. She poured coffee into 2 cups, handed one to him, then sat quietly for a moment. "They're saying you've gone viral," she said. "The video of you getting kicked out of court has over 2 million views in just 6 hours." Thomas took a slow sip of coffee, eyes still fixed on the street ahead. Fame was never the goal. I just refused to let anyone twist sacrifice into something shameful. That night, Myra's first article went live with a bold headline. "Judge orders war hero to remove medal when honor is put on trial." The piece ignited like a spark in dry brush. Across social media, hashtags like #StandWithEllis and reaction videos from veterans around the country spread with lightning speed. Organizations like the Wexley Veterans Association, the National Purple Heart Fund, and even active duty service groups shared the story. A photo of Thomas standing before the court with his medal pinned to his chest was turned into a poster plastered across bookstores, cafes, and bus stops from Georgia to Minnesota. One former Marine in Texas posted a video saying, "I've bled beside men like him." And now a courtroom says he should hide his sacrifice? No, not a chance. On a cable news channel, Thomas's image aired during a special report under the banner, "Honor or Humiliation?" Nation reacts to Wexley courtroom incident. By nightfall, Thomas's phone stopped ringing. Not because the interest had faded, but because he had unplugged it. But something else happened that Thomas couldn't ignore. Local police showed up at his door at 10 p.m., knocking with the excuse of a noise complaint. There had been no noise, just him and a cup of lukewarm tea. Thomas looked at the young officer standing on his porch, eyes uneasy. He understood. The pressure from above had begun, and this battle, clearly, was no longer confined to four courtroom walls. It had crossed beyond the reach of the law and was now working its way into the hearts of the people. 3 days after Mira Thatch's article set the internet ablaze, Thomas Vincent Ellis received an unexpected letter from the Veterans Administration. Inside was a notice suspending his benefits, pending an administrative review due to anomalies in documentation. Thomas read each word carefully. There were no details, just a cold, stony wall of bureaucratic language. He sighed, folded the letter, and called his nephew Jalen Reddick, a second-year law student at Columbia University. No answer. Later that afternoon, Jalen called back from an unfamiliar number, voice tight. "Grandpa, my scholarship's under review. They said there are concerns about academic alignment. My advisor just got summoned to the dean's office." Thomas didn't press. He just sat still on the porch, his hand tightening around the handle of his wooden cane. A strike to the wallet. A strike to the future. And none of it left a mark, like punches thrown in the dark, but the target was unmistakable. That evening, he stopped by his usual supermarket on the corner of Union and Mayfield. At checkout, the cashier stared at him for a long moment before whispering, "Sorry, Mr. Ellis, the system declined your card." No reason given. He paid in cash. But as he exited to the parking lot, he noticed the store manager whispering to two employees, eyes flicking in his direction. On the wall near the lot, someone had scrawled in red paint, "Troublemaker in a uniform." Thomas didn't erase it. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the words as if they were the true face of a system that had long worn polite language as a mask. That night, his house was egged. Splatters streaked the windows and front porch. When he stepped outside, a black-painted pickup truck revved and sped away. His neighbor across the street, Larry, a fellow veteran who'd served in Afghanistan, walked over to help clean up. He didn't say much, just brought a bucket of water and a rag. "You're not alone," Larry muttered, voice gravelly. "But the folks you're up against, they don't play fair." The next morning, Thomas discovered his bank account had been temporarily frozen. The bank called to say suspicious activity had triggered a security protocol. That same morning, Officer Gavin Nels, the same man who had once investigated the controversial land case Thomas opposed, showed up unannounced at his door. "We received an anonymous tip about unusual activity at this address," Nels said as he stepped onto the porch. "Just protocol. Nothing personal, Mr. Ellis." Thomas didn't respond, but in his eyes, a fire had lit, this time not as calm as before. What was happening now was no accident, no coincidence. He knew it clearly. Someone was pulling strings, hoping he would back down. But just like on the battlefield long ago, the more surrounded he was, the more firmly he stood. Because Thomas knew one thing for certain. A soldier never retreats, especially when honor is the thing being bargained away. As Thomas Vincent Ellis sat in his wooden porch chair, a steaming cup of jasmine tea in hand, he had no idea that the wave of retaliation he'd endured had awakened something else, a silent undercurrent, spreading like groundwater beneath the surface. And that current was preparing to rise. The first call came from Delphine Rook, a renowned civil rights attorney in Wexley who had successfully sued 3 police departments for abuse of power. "I've been following your story, Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, yet laced with compassion. "They're testing you with power, so let me test them back with the law." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then replied softly, "I don't need a protector. I need someone who knows how to flip the rules without losing their conscience." Delphine smiled. Then we're teammates. At the same time, his grandson Jalen Reddick was leading a group of law students from Columbia, Howard, and Stanford in launching an online platform called Honor Law, dedicated to gathering, analyzing, and exposing judicial ethics violations nationwide. In just 72 hours, over 300 students and professors had joined. A data map began to take shape, one in which the name Hollis Trent lit up among a web of biased rulings, the exclusion of black jurors, and shady financial ties. Mira Thatch kept breathing life into the story through a series of investigative reports, revealing links between Judge Trent and real estate donors who had previously been sued for displacing residents of Glenfield Heights. Her third article was titled, "When the Gavel Strikes Off-Center, a System Sitting High While Turning Its Back on Truth." But it was a phone call from Washington, D.C. that became the tipping point. "I'm General Silas Granger," came a deep voice over the line. "You once saved my son's life in Basra in '91. Now, it's my turn to stand with you." Less than 2 days later, Granger appeared in Wexley, crisp in his uniform, medals spanning his chest. Local news cameras captured him walking into a press conference beside Thomas and Delphine. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. "Thomas Ellis doesn't need to prove his honor," Granger said into the microphone. "That honor was sealed in blood. What needs proving now is whether this system is still worthy of men like him defending it." That very evening, something dramatic occurred. While Thomas, Jalen, and Delphine were attending a community gathering at Wexley Borough Hall, the lights suddenly went out. A metallic click echoed from the back door. In the brief chaos, someone tossed a round object into the room, almost like a flare. But instead of exploding, it hissed, releasing a cloud of smoke that formed a chilling message. "Step back, or lose everything." The crowd screamed, but Thomas didn't flinch. He stepped into the smoke, slowly picked up the device, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the cold. "I've already lost almost everything," he said aloud. "But what I've never lost is the reason I'm still standing here." As the smoke cleared, silence fell over the room. No one left. Instead, they drew closer together. An elderly woman gently laid her hand on Thomas's shoulder. A teenager lifted a phone, live streaming the moment. That night, social media erupted. The hashtag Smoke and Honor hit the top 3 nationwide trends. Thomas's story was no longer just a headline. It was a battle being watched. And this time, he wasn't alone. A quiet but unyielding alliance was forming, and those hiding in the shadows were beginning to feel the heat. The news broke on a blustery Monday morning. Mira Thatch had just taken a sip of coffee at the Wexley Ledger office when an email from an anonymous sender appeared. The subject line read, "Jury rotation logs, internal only." Attached were 6 PDF files and a 3-minute audio recording. Mira opened it, her expression immediately shifting. The documents were never-before-seen internal records on jury selection under Judge Hollis Trent, showing that black jurors had been struck from panels at nearly 4 times the rate of white jurors. Some were removed for reasons like too informal, unsteady eye contact, or simply too young and dark-skinned. But the audio was the true dagger. Trent's voice rang out, unmistakable. "If you let those people on the jury, they'll side with each other like crows. I'm not letting some community folks take over justice here." In less than 24 hours, Myra's explosive expose hit the front page with a thunderous headline. "Courtroom or Clubhouse? How Judge Trent Pushed Justice Off the Bench." Social media caught fire. Legal associations, veteran groups, civil rights organizations, and even former staff who'd worked under Trent began speaking out. Major outlets from Atlanta, the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC picked up the story. The audio aired on national television, turning Wexley Borough into the center of America's legal reckoning. 3 days after the story exploded, the FIU, Federal Integrity Unit, announced an emergency investigation into allegations of racial bias and judicial manipulation tied to Judge Trent. That evening, Thomas Vincent Ellis sat in front of the television with Delphine Rook, Jalen, and Mira. On the screen appeared a young woman in a black blazer stepping out of a federal building. It was Mira Saunders, Trent's former clerk. She was the one who had secretly recorded the conversation and sent the files to Mira Thatch. "She was incredibly brave," Delphine said quietly. "If it hadn't been for her, the truth would still be locked away in a safe, and they'd still be playing their power games like they've done for years." But what no one expected came from Trent himself. The next morning, he held a press conference. His silver hair was neatly combed, his dark suit crisply pressed, but his expression bore the unmistakable lines of collapse. I'm stepping down not because I admit wrongdoing, he said, still clinging to arrogance. I'm doing it to protect the integrity of the judiciary from a wave of emotion driven by biased media. As the footage aired on TV, Thomas said nothing. He simply stood and walked out to his porch. The late afternoon sun gleamed on the purple heart pinned to his chest. The small stone path leading from his porch suddenly seemed longer, but this time, he wasn't walking it alone. Delphine called from the kitchen. "Mr. Ellis, you should know. The FIU just issued an official suspension order. Trent won't be presiding over any more cases until the investigation concludes." Thomas turned his head and smiled faintly. Not a smile of victory, but of someone who knew he'd chosen the right path, even if it meant walking through a system drowning in shadows. And in Wexley Borough, people began to say a new phrase, the Ellis effect, not because he won anything for himself, but because he made justice, for the first time in years, look itself in the mirror. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday at the United States Capitol. Out on the lawn, a crowd of more than 300 people had gathered since early morning. Veterans, law students, activists, and even those who had only known Thomas Vincent Ellis through a screen. Many wore replicas of the Purple Heart pinned to their clothes. Some even taped his photo to their briefcases, as if he were not just a man, but a symbol. Inside the hearing chamber, the air was stiflingly quiet as Thomas wheeled himself to the center. He wore a full military dress, every fold perfectly pressed, medals gleaming under the ceiling lights. On his collar was the insignia of the unit he had once led in the Gulf War. The committee chair opened the session. "We invite Mr. Thomas Vincent Ellis, former U.S. Army colonel, to deliver his testimony before Congress regarding the proposed Ellis Integrity Act." Thomas took a deep breath. Then he began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, needing no amplification, "I'm not here to recount war stories. I'm not here to complain. I'm here to ask one question. Who gets to define dignity? I used to believe that in America, dignity came from action, not from skin color, not from position, and not from how many medals you wear." He paused briefly, then continued. "But then I walked into a courtroom where I wasn't seen as someone who bled for this country, but as someone who needed to be removed to preserve a false sense of order. They told me to remove my medals, said they were disruptive. But the only thing disruptive in that room was the truth I carried on my chest." The room went still. A young congressman discreetly wiped away tears. Thomas continued, his voice steady but sharp as steel. "If the legal system can ask a veteran to strip away proof of sacrifice, then it can ask anyone to abandon their honor just to enter a courtroom. And a system like that needs to be judged, not by authority but by ethics." Delphine Rook, seated in the front row, watched Thomas without blinking. Jalen Reddick scribbled notes like his life depended on every word. Mira Thatch recorded the entire speech from start to finish. 1 week later, the official draft of the Ellis Integrity Act was introduced to the Senate. The legislation included a constitutional right for veterans to retain their medals during legal proceedings, a mandate for transparent jury selection data, and the formation of an independent judicial oversight council. That evening, the national news aired footage of President Lyle Harmon shaking Thomas's hand in the Oval Office, with the embossed seal of the United States on the bill between them. That night in Glenfield Heights, neighbors gathered in front of Thomas's home with candles, flags, and a local church choir. When he opened the door, they began to sing America the Beautiful. No speeches, no slogans. A small boy about 8 years old stepped forward and held up a pencil drawing, a sketch of an elderly man in a wheelchair wearing medals, with a Capitol building behind him. Beneath it, in crooked handwriting, were the words, "You're the reason I still believe America is good." Thomas leaned down and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. And in that moment, every battle, every wound, every sacrifice seemed to find a reason to continue. 1 month after the Ellis Integrity Act was passed, the massive doors of Wexley Federal Courthouse no longer creaked with age. They'd been replaced, just like the system that had once trembled under the weight of exposure. The newly formed Federal Judicial Oversight Committee, established under Article 3 of a new law, released a list of 237 cases presided over by Judge Hollis Trent that were now under review for signs of bias, irregular jury selection, and conflicts of interest. Over 80 of those cases involved defendants of color who had received harsher than standard sentences. And it didn't stop with Wexley. States like Illinois, Texas, New York, and California launched independent investigations into judges with abnormal records of striking black jurors. On the internal statistical map published by Jalen Reddick's student group, red zones, areas flagged for urgent monitoring, were lighting up more each day. In Glenfield Heights, Thomas Vincent Ellis didn't rest. Alongside Delphine Rook and General Silas Granger, he founded the Honor Bench Project, a nonprofit organization that monitors local courtrooms. Funded by grassroots donations, the group deployed volunteers to courtrooms across the state to observe, document, and, when necessary, speak out. A bittersweet incident unfolded in a courtroom in Lamar County when a local judge ordered a veteran to remove his duty insignia, claiming it was distracting to the jury. The veteran calmly pulled out his phone, recorded the session, and sent the footage to the project's official page. The clip hit over 2.5 million views within 8 hours, captioned, "Still haven't learned from Ellis?" By the end of that week, the judge issued a public apology and temporarily stepped down to reevaluate procedural conduct. Social media dubbed it the Medal Effect, Part 2. At the VA, Department of Veterans Affairs, following mounting pressure from Congress and the public, over 1,100 veterans had their previously suspended benefits reinstated, benefits that had been denied on dubious administrative grounds. Thomas received a letter signed by the VA director, which read, "You've forced us to look at ourselves." And that was long overdue. One afternoon, while Thomas was trimming the grass behind his house, Jalen showed up with a thick envelope from Washington. Beaming like a kid, he announced, "You've been invited as the keynote speaker for the new federal judicial training program. All newly appointed judges are now required to attend." The theme? Justice cannot be forgotten. Thomas set his hoe down and looked out at the empty backyard, the same spot where he once sat in silence with a cup of cold tea, listening to the first news broadcast about his own case. "You know," he said, eyes glinting, "I used to think justice was a building. Now I understand it's more like a garden. If no one tends to it, it grows thorns instead of flowers." And at sunset that evening, as the golden light streamed across his porch and birds soared overhead, Thomas Vincent Ellis understood he hadn't just corrected a wrong. He'd replanted faith, not through noise or slogans, but with the endurance of someone who knew how to hold the line, whether on a battlefield or in a courtroom full of bias. 3 weeks after the Ellis Integrity Act went into nationwide effect, a thin envelope appeared on Thomas's doorstep in Glenfield Heights. No return address, no postal markings, just his name written in a familiar hand, short and precise, like the voice that once echoed behind a judge's bench. Thomas paused. He already knew who had written it. Inside was a handwritten letter, scrawled on the deep yellow notepaper once common in judicial chambers. The first line struck like a hammer. "I let power blur what was right, and you forced me to face myself, not with rage, not with insults, but with the unshaken presence of a man who never backed down." Signed, Hollis Trent. No excuses, no detours, no ifs or buts, just admission. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, the man who once wielded the gavel had placed truth above his own seat. Thomas folded the letter and placed it on the wooden kitchen table, the one that had witnessed countless silent dinners with Naira Elston during the most turbulent months of his case. The next morning, he made a phone call. Short. No one heard what he said, except the first 4 words, "I want to meet." They met at a small cafe behind Caldera Pavilion, the same place that once hosted the press conference for the Ellis Integrity Act. No reporters, no security detail, just 2 men sitting across from each other, each with a black coffee. A server later recalled they sat for nearly an hour, speaking little. But at one moment, Thomas smiled faintly, shook his head, and placed his hand on the table. Trent, thinner now, hair fully silver, bowed his head in quiet reply. Then they stood, shook hands, and walked off in opposite directions. That afternoon, back home, Thomas took down a small plaque from the wall beside his Purple Heart. The old plaque read, "Never forget. Never forgive." He replaced it with a new one bearing a single line. Honor isn't for preserving the past. It's for opening the future. And from that day forward, he never spoke Hollis Trent's name again. But those who knew Thomas noticed something. His step was lighter. His voice warmer. The weight in his eyes gone. Perhaps because he had forgiven. Not because the other man deserved it, but because he deserved to walk forward without carrying someone else's shame. Every November, at Hillcrest Memorial Grounds, rows of small flags line the pathway to the Veterans Memorial. But one flag doesn't flutter in the wind. It rests within an oak frame in front of a bronze bust. Thomas Vincent Ellis, age 62, veteran, guardian of dignity. There is no grand monument, no declaration etched in stone, just a simple plaque, its message carved by hand. He didn't have to shout to be heard. After the congressional hearing, after the Ellis Integrity Act passed, and after his final meeting with Hollis Trent, Thomas returned to his quiet life in Glenfield Heights. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews. When a major network offered to produce a documentary, he simply replied, "If I stayed silent when I was insulted, I don't need to speak now that I'm being honored." But what he didn't say echoed further than anything he ever could have. At military academies, the Ellis scenario became part of the ethics curriculum. In law schools, professors posed open-ended questions. If it were you, would you remove the medal or stand your ground? And in elementary classrooms, black children began to hear his name as proof that you can stand tall, even when the whole room wants you to bow your head. His granddaughter, Desiree Holloway, graduated valedictorian from law school the following year. During her commencement speech, she didn't mention him by name. She simply read a passage once printed on the back cover of the previous year's hearing program. Silence isn't the space between two voices. It's the weight of what's left unsaid. And sometimes, that is the most powerful thing in a nation full of noise. Thomas's story became a symbol, not because he won a court case, but because he reclaimed something many believed was lost: the right to hold on to your dignity without needing permission. Years later, people would ask those who witnessed that courtroom day, "Do you remember any legal arguments? Any cross-examinations?" No one did. They only remembered a black man standing silently behind the defendant's bench. No shouting, no pleading, just a single medal on his chest, as if reminding the world, "I don't need your recognition to exist. I only need the truth to stay exactly where it belongs." And perhaps from that very silence, an entire system was finally forced to speak.